This morning we start session 2 of a series called Desperate. It'll be going on this entire month. And for you guys, you can go to work tomorrow and tell everyone that you went to church with Julia Roberts this morning. So I guess that's a good thing. I don't know. Desperation is this thing within us, this feeling that things are not going to change, and we have pain plus time equals desperation. There was a movie that came out a couple of years ago called The 33. It was a movie about 33 Chilean miners who had been trapped underground due to a cave-in of their mine. And when this happened, it's a real story, a true story about 33 real miners. And when this happened, the people that kind of know about things like this studied the topography, they studied the formations, and they came up with the idea or the chance that there was only a 2% chance that these miners would ever be rescued and ever be seen again alive. The movie was adapted from a book. And the name of the book was The Deep Down Dark. And I can't think of a better description of desperation than the deep down dark. That situation in our lives where our current situation and the things going on around us have blinded us to everything except what's going on right in front of us. And just like being in the dark of this mine, these men were in the dark of that mine for days on end with very little food, almost not enough water. And so what they did is they did something revolutionary. In their deep down dark, there was a man by the name of Jose Saraquez. He was 54 years old, and all the miners knew that he was a Christian. And so they asked him if he would pray a desperate prayer, and his prayer began like this: Dear God, we aren't the best of men. We're sinners, and we need you. Well, if you're familiar with the movie, familiar with the book, that simple prayer started revival. For days, every morning they would come together and they would pray together, and he would preach to them from the Bible that he could remember because he couldn't see. He didn't have it with him, and if he did, he couldn't have read it. But he would preach to them from what he could remember of the Bible, and what was happening is through this revival, they started confessing parts of their lives, things like alcoholism and addiction, things like not being a good parent and problems in their marriage. And what had happened was in this deep down dark, they had experienced desperation like they had never experienced it before. And desperate moments usually bring us to this deep down dark, because regular life has too many distractions. And it has too many demands, and we're so busy that we don't have time for desperation, and we don't have time for revival. We don't have time for confession. Most people don't even have time for worship. But when you get to the deep down dark, the circumstance makes you take time. And it causes us to open up in ways that we never imagined. More than anything else, humble desperation invites the power of God to be demonstrated in our life. It's our humble desperation that invites God in to the situation that has caused us to be in the deep down dark. You know, asking for revival in our life really is powerless unless we're desperate. You know, sometimes if you've ever heard someone pray and they confess their sins, they're so general and they're so vague as if they're trying to fool God. But when you're in the deep down dark, you're willing to be very honest. You're willing to be very open. When you get to that point of desperation, what happens is in that desperation, we find that God works. When you've just heard that you have stage 4 cancer, or your spouse has just said, I don't love you anymore, I think I'm leaving. It forces you into that deep down dark. And it forces you to ask God for revival. Back to the story of the 33 before we get to our story. It's kind of interesting what happens in that movie and in that book, and literally what happened to those miners. Eventually, they were able to drill a hole that would create a shaft that they could start sending food and water to the miners. And they also were sending news down to the miners. And the miners started reading the news because now they had some lighting, they had plenty of food, and they found out that they had become worldwide celebrities, that everyone in the world knew about their plight. And when they came out of there, they stopped talking about confession and revival, and they started talking about how they were going to make a buck off this predicament. And you know, sometimes when we get out of that deep down dark and that light hits us, we forget so much about the God who got us through the deep down dark. In all of our lives, we'll experience this. We'll experience the deep down dark. It may happen in a hospital, it may happen in a funeral home, it may happen in your loneliness, but what I'm asking you to do this morning and throughout this entire series is that if you're in that deep down dark, or when you get to that deep down dark, don't ignore the beauty of that moment. Because in the deep down dark, there is still beauty. Hidden in that pain is an incredible gift. And that's what we're going to talk about this morning, the gift that's hidden in the deep down dark. Our story this morning comes from the book of 2 Kings chapter 5. And it's the story of this general, and his name's Naaman. And Naaman is the leader, the general of the Aramean army, the Syrian army. And I'll tell you, the guy is well known amongst his peers. He's valiant. He's strong. He's driven. He's famous. He's wealthy. He feels invincible. And then one day, as he's getting dressed, he starts noticing discolored patches on his skin. And for days, he would just cover it up with his clothing. He'd go on about his business. And then the next day, he would see that he had more discolorations on his skin. And then he began to feel numbness in his fingers. And we find out, and he finds out and realizes he has leprosy. And even though he's strong and he's valiant and he's feared and he's famous and he's wealthy, he's sick. And it was the kind of sickness that during this time was not just being sick, it was a death sentence. For Naaman, this was the same as social exclusion. He was going to be ostracized from society. His family was going to disown him. They couldn't be around him. He was going to be separated from everyone, rejected. And the irony of the story is that even though he was powerful, even though he was strong, even though he was wealthy, he had run into something that he could not fix. He was sick, and he was helpless. The story starts in 2 Kings 5, verse 1. Now Naaman, the captain of the army, the king of Aram, was a great man with his master and highly respected. And because of this, because by him the Lord had given victory to Aram. And the man who was also a valiant warrior, but he was a leper. Now I want you to imagine with me what he was going through. He was going through a real challenge of character. He was going through a real inner struggle. And for him, he knew where his life was headed if nothing could be done to deal with his sickness. And so he becomes desperate. But he doesn't become desperate overnight. And that's where the 4 degrees of desperation come in. And we're going to see those 4 degrees in this story. The first degree of desperation is this. It's the acknowledgement of need. You know, it usually takes us a while to get to this point. Because usually we like to believe that we can deal with things on our own. We like to believe that we can fix our own problems, especially Americans. We live in a world, in a land that says, you are your own destiny. You can fix whatever. You go, girl. You do whatever you got to do. And what happens is that it takes us a long time to get to the point where we want to acknowledge that we really are in need. But eventually we can no longer ignore our condition. And we can no longer control our situations. And we don't want to acknowledge need immediately because it feels like weakness. But eventually, when we get to the deep down dark, that's when we acknowledge our need. A lot of people don't realize that when you hit rock bottom, the rock of rock bottom is a great foundation to build the rest of your life. But we have to wait till we get there before we are willing to admit our need in most of the time. Well, as Naaman begins to acknowledge his need, he meets a girl, a slave girl. It's his wife's slave. And as he meets this slave girl and he gets to know her, she reaches out to him in a very special way. She was Jewish. She was someone who became a slave to his wife because of Naaman. Naaman and his armies had overcome Israel and they had taken slaves. Naaman had probably killed her family. Naaman had probably been the very one to declare victory over her people. He'd enslaved her entire nation. And when she heard what was going on, she knew exactly what was wrong with him. And I'm going to tell you, if I had been this girl, my reaction would have been much different from hers. I mean, you killed my family and you enslaved me and you enslaved my nation. You conquer my people and I hear you're sick. Serves you right. You'd hear things like, well, it couldn't happen to a better guy. But not her. The story goes on in verses 2 and 3. It says, now the Arameans had gone out in bands and had taken captive a little girl from the land of Israel, and she waited on Naaman's wife. And she said to her mistress, I wish that my master were with the prophet who's in Samaria. Then he would cure him of his leprosy. When will we be desperate enough to listen to someone who we ordinarily wouldn't listen to? When you get to the point where you acknowledge your need, that's one thing. But there's a second degree of desperation that we have to think about. The second degree of desperation is that we're open to godly counsel. Sometimes we get to this point of the deep down dark and we need to stop listening to ourselves. We need to stop being part of this tug of war with us versus our pride. And listening to godly counsel puts you in a good place because we all need God desperately. And I love this woman's attitude. And I love this young girl's wisdom. Because if she had gone to him before, he would have never listened to her about a prophet who is in Samaria. The timing had to be right. The situation had to be right. He had to be desperate enough to listen to someone. Why? Why now? Why was he willing to listen to her? If you don't get much out of what I say this morning, don't forget what I'm about to say. The reason he was able to listen to godly counsel, he was open to godly counsel, is because things had just got personal. You see, it's interesting. When we're in our deep down dark and we acknowledge our need, but now someone has come to us with godly counsel, things that we probably wouldn't have considered before because of our doubts and because of our struggles, when it gets personal, we don't worry about whether or not God created the world in 7 days or not. Oh, when our desperation gets personal, we don't ask questions like, well, where were the dinosaurs on the ark? We don't worry about whether Jonah was swallowed by a whale, a great fish, or a guppy. We don't care because it got personal. And with Naaman, it had gotten personal. It wasn't about everybody else. It wasn't about a big picture. It was just about him. But you see, Naaman's still not there yet. If you're reading along in the story, I don't have the scriptures up here because we're just going to do an overview here. But what Naaman does is he does hear about this prophet in Samaria. The prophet's name's Elisha. He doesn't know that yet. And he listens to the words of the slave girl. He's able to hear godly counsel, but his pride still will not let him humbly go to Israel because he conquered Israel. He was over Israel. So what he does instead is he goes to the king of Aram. And when he gets to the king of Aram, he asks him to write a letter to the king of Israel and to tell him that the king of Israel was to get him cured of his leprosy. And so he takes his letter, he gathers all this loot, all this money, all this stuff. He takes a huge entourage and he heads over to Israel. He goes to the king of Israel. He hands him the letter from the king of Aram. And the king of Israel is afraid of the king of Aram because he's already been defeated. And the king of Israel cries out, "Who am I? Do you think I'm God? Do you think I can heal people of leprosy, that I say one man lives and one man dies?" And he tore his clothes, and then Elisha heard that the king was in great peril. And so he sends word to him and says, "Tell him to come to me. Because if he'll come to me, I will show him that there really is a prophet in Israel." Well, that leads us to the third degree of desperation. You know, the first one is acknowledging need. You know, we all need to acknowledge our need in order to get help in the deep down dark. And being open to godly counsel is good. But what's happening next is not about knowing the need and listening to something. It's about doing something about it. The third one is the willingness to ask for help. In all of our experiences, we have found that it's dangerous to ask for help. And I know you're thinking, what's he talking about? We found it's dangerous to ask for help because we have been rejected so many times that a lot of us have been in our deep down dark, and we may have trusted people that we shouldn't have trusted or asked people that we shouldn't have asked, and we knew that we had a need and we were open to God working in our lives, but somehow when we asked for that help, we were rejected. And as a side note, if that's you, if you're right now in that deep down dark, I don't think Clear Creek will reject you. I don't believe that the people here would turn their back on you if you were willing to ask for help. I can remember an illustration in my own experience about asking for help and my reticence to ask for help. Years ago, when Olivia was just a baby, my wife and I lived in Springfield, and we drove an old Buick LeSabre. And we were going to my in-laws' house, and the alternator went out in the Buick LeSabre. And so I get it in the driveway, we get down there, I use my mother-in-law's car, I go to get an alternator, and I'm out fixing the alternator. My father-in-law wasn't there to help, and so here I was on my own, young guy, never done anything like this before, I'm replacing an alternator. And so I work on it, and I get the old alternator off, and I get the new alternator on, and you got this serpentine belt, and it's really, really tight, and I kept trying to get this belt back on the alternator. I worked for 2.5 hours solid. I used pry bars, crowbars, wrenches, anything I could to try and pry that belt back on the pulley that was on the alternator. And I tried everything but kerosene and hand grenades, right? And finally, I'm sweating, it's hot. I go in the house and get a drink of water, and my wife asks me, she says, "How's it going?" Ugh. And so, I got this belt. I just can't get it back on there, but I'm going to get it. And then she says, "What do you think Bill could help?" And Bill was my mother-in-law's next-door neighbor. And she said, "Do you think Bill could help?" Now, that's what she said. Here's what I heard. "Since you're not man enough to deal with our alternator needs, Do you think that I should go and ask the much better looking, svelte, manly man who lives next door to my mother to help you with this alternator? And if you know me well enough, you know what my answer was. No, I'll get it. So I go back in the driveway. I'm still working half hour. Still, I am not any closer than I was to putting the belt back on. And I look up, and guess who's walking down my drive? I heard that driveway. Bill. I didn't like Bill. Still don't. The only reason I don't like him is the same reason I don't like Tom Brady. He's just too good looking. You ever met somebody like that? I mean, it's not fair. Bill comes down the driveway. What you doing? He was very nice. I had no reason not to like him. And I told him, and he says, you got a 1/2-inch socket? I thought about going in and asking my wife if I had a 1/2-inch socket. That probably wouldn't have went well. I said, yeah, I do. He says, let me show you a trick I know. It wasn't a trick. Everybody knew this but me. He gets in there with a 1/2-inch socket. He pulls this tension pulley, wraps the belt around, and I got an alternator that works. 5 seconds. 5 seconds. Now listen, I'd been at it 3 hours. 5 seconds. 3 hours of my life I'll never get back because I would not ask for help. Naaman's the same way. Naaman doesn't really want to ask for help. He goes to this king. Well, he eventually does go to find Elisha. And he shows up. Cash, letter, entourage, pride intact. And when Elijah sees him coming, he knows that God's not going to deal with this. God won't deal with someone who's coming from a position of pride. And so what he does is he does something to humble him. He sends out a slave. Now remember, a slave had told him how to fix the problem, and now another slave is going to tell him how to fix the problem. And so he sends out, I'm going to call him his intern. His name is Gehazi, and I don't say that very well, so I'm going to call him his intern Sean. He sends out his intern Sean. And Sean comes out, and he tells him this. So Naaman came with his horses and chariots and stood in the doorway at the house of Elisha, and Elisha sent out a messenger to him saying, go wash in the Jordan 7 times, and your flesh will be restored to you, and you will be clean. And Naaman is insulted. A slave? Don't you know who I am? Don't you see all these folks? Don't you see all this loot? And you're not even going to come out of your house? I mean, certainly you know who I am. As a matter of fact, the story goes on. In verse 11 and 12, it says, but Naaman was furious and went away and said, behold, I thought he would surely come out to me and stand and call on the name of the Lord his God and wave his hand over me and place over the place and cure the leper. Are not, I'm going to try and read these, Abana and Pharpar, I hope that's how you say them, the rivers of Damascus better than all the waters of Israel? Could I not wash in them and be clean? So he turned away and he went in a rage. You know what his real problem was? Same problem we have when we get to this point. Well, we'll acknowledge need. Yeah, we'll listen to godly counsel, but when it comes to asking for help, sometimes when our pride's intact, we want that camera crew there. That's what he wanted. He wanted someone to see what was happening and think he was still just this great guy, and he was going to be able to pay for this healing, and that God would respond to a great general. He wanted everyone around to know what an awesome dude he was, and then this little old servant comes out and says, hey, go down to the river and wash. That wasn't what he was expecting. He was expecting something grand. He was expecting pomp. He was expecting circumstance. He was expecting excitement. And what he got was advice from a slave to do something that he thought was so far beneath him. And he's still not quite there. And then we get into verse 13. It says, then his servant came over and spoke to him. Now, before we go any further, you can look at that. A servant had told him how to fix his problem. A servant had told him how to fix his problem. And now guess what? Another servant tells him how to fix his problem. This great man, someone humble, tells him how to fix their problem. My father, had the prophet told you to do some great thing, would you not have done it? I mean, how much more than when he says to you, wash and be clean? And he's saying, you know what, if this servant would have come out and said, give Elisha $1 million, you'd have given him 2. If he'd have come out and said, if you will do some mighty act of valor, it would have already been done. If he'd have said, you need to go conquer a nation, the battle would be going on right now. But when he asks you to do something simple, you're not willing to do it. It doesn't make sense. Well, he'd been through the 3 degrees, but now he was at the 4th degree. And you see, the 4th degree of desperation is the one that catches all of us. You know, we'll acknowledge need, and sometimes we'll listen to godly counsel, and we'll even ask for help. But when we hear what the help is, sometimes we're just not sure that's what we want to do, because the 4th is this: a readiness to obey God. I picked the opening video that we saw from Eat, Pray, Love, because she says one thing in that video that I find fascinating. She tells God, God, tell me what to do, and I will do it. And she's a liar, just like most people are. I know, you're not going to want to walk away and hear that. But if you're in the ministry, you know people, there's lots of people who say, God, just tell me what to do and I'll do it. And when he tells us what to do, so, wait a minute. I'm not sure. I can do that. But when you're in the deep down dark, that 4th degree of desperation doesn't seem like that big a hurdle, because at that point, what you weren't open to before, you are now. What didn't make sense before doesn't even matter. When you thought other people that followed God were weak-minded, you realize that no, that they were strong people. And now you're open. And if this is you, when will you get desperate enough to actually obey God? Well, Naaman comes to the river and something happens here, and I don't want you to miss it. Naaman does go to the Jordan River. And before I read the verse, I want to set the scene for you. He goes to the river and he takes off his armor. And then he takes off his tunic. It doesn't tell us in the scripture, but in order to do what he's going to do, he has to do all these things. And when he does that, everyone sees his disease. When he does that, he makes himself vulnerable to everyone around him, and there's no longer any secrets. And that's when God comes to work. When we will bear ourselves before him, when we get to the point where we don't care about the humiliation, we don't care about the shock, all we want is truth. When we get into our deepest moments of vulnerability, that's when God shows up. And in 2 Kings 5:14 it says, so he went down and dipped himself 7 times in the river Jordan, according to the word of the man of God, and his flesh was restored like the flesh of a little child, and he was clean. He did exactly what he was asked to do. He did exactly what he was told to do. It's interesting how similar this is to baptism, and how baptism still trips people up today. Oh, why do I have to do that? Let me explain why I shouldn't have to do that. When it's just so simple to meet God at the water. Well, it's kind of interesting. Naaman returns to Elisha's home after this is over, and he demands to pay Elisha for the blessing that he had received from God. And in verse 15 and 16 it says, when he returned to the man of God with all his company and came down and stood before him, he said, behold now, I know that there is no God in all the earth but in Israel. So please take a present from me, from your servant now. But he said, as the Lord lives before whom I stand, I will take nothing. And he urged him to take it, but he refused. He wanted to pay his way. Guys, we can't. Do you see the similarities here? About how so many times we get down the deep down dark and we don't want to acknowledge our need, but when we acknowledge our need, we'll get godly counsel. When we'll be open to godly counsel, we'll be willing to ask for help. And eventually when we're willing to ask for help, if we're truly in that deep down dark, we're ready to obey God. Our stories intersect with Naaman. Because when we come before God with our vulnerability and with our deep down heart, we have no bragging rights. We can't pay for our blessing. The gospel is good news, but it's not good news because we're good people, because the gospel is a humbling story. We're saved by someone who saved us because we couldn't save ourselves. And today's the day to skip to level 4. Today's the day for you to be willing to obey God. I mean, what else is going to happen? What else needs to hurt? What else needs to be destroyed in your life before you become personal enough to obey?